Dear friends, today I have a special guest, the Right Honorable Sir John Vincent Кейбл, professor at the London School of Economics, who was a member of the British Parliament for 18 years, who was also a leader of Liberal Democrats Party and who served as a Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills from 2010 to 2015. Hello, Vince, and thank you very much for agreeing to this interview.
No, thank you for inviting me, and I'm just recovering from the journey back, but it was a wonderful experience to have been in Kiev with you and your colleagues.
Yes, Vins Кейбл visited Kiev last week and gave an excellent lecture on relations between China and West. I'll try to find the record of that lecture, and if it is public, I'll add to this video in the description of this video, colleagues. So check it. It was really great. And
I will happily send you the overheads if you like. Yeah.
Okay, it should be great, I think, for our viewers also. And speaking in Kiev, Vince said that he was amazed that Kiev is almost 99% living the life of a normal city. Of course, if you don't consider the explosions in the night. Vince, what else do you remember? What else have you touched from this trip to Ukraine?
Well, I was only sadly there for a short time. But I think several things stuck. First of all, I was taken on a trip to Irpin, spent half a day there. And when you see the devastation and the criminal shooting of people in cars and so on, you realize why you're fighting this war. It's not just a war of aggression, but cruelty. And you have a fight for survival, and I saw it firsthand what had happened. So that was left a very deep impression. Secondly, the kind of practical problems of traveling in and out of Ukraine. I mean, 17-hour bus journey back, the difficulties on the Polish border. You realize that being in Ukraine in wartime without airports is very difficult, and we perhaps underestimate the problems there. And I think finally, although it was, Kiev is a normal, functioning, rather wonderful city, we did have the banging in the night from the air raid, and you're very close to a very dangerous situation, although people are acting very normally and indeed bravely.
Now let's thank you for your support and for your coming, because I'm sure that every coming of foreigners to Ukraine, especially such an experience, and the foreigners with a high reputation in the world like you, it's a very important sign of support of Ukraine. It shows that Ukraine is not a black hole somewhere. It's not like a Somali. It's a real functioning country with the fighting people, with the normal and life and non-normal life. But it's very important for us today. It shows that we are not alone, and we are still in a normal side. And we have a future, and we have a hope. But now let's talk about the Ukrainian-British relation. I can share such kind of my light feelings in this sphere, because formally the change from Boris Johnson and Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister of Britain, and from Ben Wallace to Grant Shapps as the Secretary of State for Defense of the United Kingdom, today he is in Ukraine, did not lead to significant changes between our countries. Britain will remain one of the leaders in military, technical, and financial assistance to Ukraine, more than 4 billion pounds. It's Ukrainian data on financial assistance. The first heavy tank Challenger, the first long-range rocket, Shadow Storm, sea drones, and much more. But at the same time, now, after the last change of the government, is there some kind of feeling that Britain is less involved in Ukraine situation? Isn't it? Or am I wrong?
I don't think there's any change in the support at a sort of public level. I think the issue about the government is that Boris Johnson was extremely unpopular at that stage of his prime ministership. But Ukraine was one issue he got right. And so he made a big demonstration of his support. And he's a very good showman, a very good public relations. But the fact that the current prime minister is what we call a bean counter, he's an accountant, he's quite dull. It doesn't affect, I think, the underlying support. It was very striking at our party conference. It will also be the same with the Labour Party, that we haven't changed our view. And I think the public are very much there. You drive through British towns and villages. There are a lot of blue and yellow flags. The refugees who came here are very welcome still. There's not a problem. The only danger is that because it is no longer the #1 story on the news every day, is that people have switched on to other subjects, but it's not a lack of support.
But it looks like Rishi Sunak is not so geopolitically oriented like Boris Johnson. And nowadays, Ministry of Defense in Britain, he's not such a professional and experienced in this field like his previous colleague.
Well, they're not the same characters. And Sunak is preparing really for the fact that the Conservatives face a very big defeat in the election next year. He's desperately trying to save the government by doing some challenging, I would say, stupid things, abandoning net zero objectives, all kind of cancelling a very big railway project, just to save some money and show he's in charge. It's not good government, but I don't think it affects the attitude to Ukraine, which is a kind of constant. It's not being pushed in our face in the way that it was with Boris Johnson, but I don't think there's any change in the underlying support.
But this government is not showing that readiness to develop the cooperation with Ukraine. Oh yes, of course, they are ready to save that high level of cooperation with Ukraine, which we have for now. But this government hasn't supported enough Ukrainian membership in NATO, in Vilnius summit, for example. And they are not so active or giving for Ukraine new weapons. I'm talking, for example, aircrafts and so on. But it's only my feelings. And as a political expert, I'm trying to find the black cat in the room where isn't it even in this moment. Sometimes
I think all I would say, I don't know exactly what the British government is doing and saying privately to you about security. I think the truth is that Britain is very, very close to the United States. And so much more than Germany and France. So that the British government will be taking its lead from the Biden administration. And the Biden administration will say, you know, we must do this about NATO. And I think the British government will just follow that line. I think that's essentially what's happening. And we know that there is this long-standing issue about Ukraine and NATO, goes back, as you know, many years, and the ambiguity has probably one of the factors which has led to this war. But I think the Western countries are reluctant to make this commitment now because this would make the West directly in conflict with Russia, with all the implications that has for strategic nuclear weapons and so on. So I think it's a common position amongst the Western countries led by the United States, and the British are following that direction.
And how much internal economical problem in Great Britain influence on Ukrainian-British relation? For example, the economical struggles inside of United States supports the Trump's movement, so-called, which is Ukraine skeptic movement, we can say such type. Are there in Great Britain such movements or parties which could use this internal economical problem in Great Britain for the voting, for weakening the support of Ukraine, or not?
We have no Trump type movements in UK, nor do we have like the German new policy, the 20% populist party.
But you had a Brexit movement which was also out of system sometimes movement.
Yes, but it's strange, but this is one area where the pro-Brexit and the anti-Brexit people agree on Ukraine. There is no faction in the parties, no new parties that are saying we must disengage from Ukraine. I think the only problem is that, of course, that the British economy is in a bad way. There's no growth. And the government has a serious problem of external debt and managing the deficit. So there is this question about how we pay for contributing economic assistance and military spending. That is an issue, not just for Ukraine, but for many other aspects of spending. And the only discordant note in my party's conference was when people asked a difficult question, which is, why is the Ukraine war being paid by taking money away from the overseas aid program, which was dedicated to the poorest countries? And I think there is a genuine problem there, but it doesn't. The suggestion is not that we cut aid to Ukraine, but that we increase aid for its proper purposes to poor countries.
Next year, there will be a parliamentary election in Britain, and likely a change of government from conservative to Labour. What changes await Ukrainian-British relation, if it happened?
I don't think it will affect things, but I did some scenario planning, to go back to your area of interest, on the outcome of the election. I think probably about 5% probability that the Conservatives will win, but very unlikely. And if they did, it would be a very weak government, but it wouldn't change its approach to Ukraine. I would say there's a 45% probability that the Labour Party will win an overall majority on its own. But again, you know, they seem to be very solid on the issue of Ukraine. And then the biggest likelihood, say 50%, is that you will have a Labour government but without an overall majority, and maybe then dependent on my party, the Liberal Democrats, to sustain it in office. And a government like that would not be very, very confident, not able to be very decisive, but the parties don't have any disagreement on the Ukraine issue.
But changing the government next year, how it will affect on the relation between Britain and the United States and European Union?
Well, I think from the British side, there is no wish to change the arrangements with the United States. The big imponderable, which is frightening people here, but nobody has an answer, is if Trump wins. And that now seems quite possible, maybe not likely, but possible. And of course, Trump could walk away from Europe, decide he doesn't want to continue the NATO alliance. All kind of very, very dangerous, big strategic changes could happen if we get Trump.
Some problems.
And I think Europeans will then become much closer together. We will not rejoin the European Union, but we will form closer defenses agreement with France and Germany.
How Britain and Europe is preparing for possible Trump's coming?
They're not preparing. They're just hoping, fearing. But I see no evidence of preparing.
I think it's not the best strategy. In any case, we have to make different scenarios of development of situation. Of course, what do you think? What is the general geopolitical and geoeconomical goal of Great Britain in Ukraine? What is the interest of Great Britain in Ukraine? Is there any, or it's only Russian-Britain relations?
Well, there is no strong economic interest. I mean, clearly we like to trade and have investment, but it's not a big element of the British economy compared with, the rest of Europe, compared with China, compared with the United States. No, that's not a direct interest, but I think there is an understanding that Europe's security is precarious, that Russia is a threat to all of Europe, and that Ukraine is where this threat is being tested. And if we fail, and if you fail, we are all in danger. That I think is at the bottom where the British interest lies.
But Great Britain has a huge economical interest around the world, even in less stable countries than Ukraine. Why we don't have such a strong economical ties between our countries?
I don't think there's any systematic reason. It's just that historically, Britain has had quite a weak export performance, and Ukraine, when I was Secretary of State, we discovered that, for example, in trade with China, we were behind not just America and Germany, but also France and Italy. And unfortunately, Britain has not been very good at building up its trade relations with countries outside the European Union. It's just it's not specific to Ukraine. It's a general problem.
How do you think what sectors of economic we can develop together? What the economical future, trade future between our countries could be, of course?
Well, I think there are some British companies who are beginning to see the importance of Ukraine as it becomes more integrated with the world economy. I mean, for example, you need to develop your defense industries to become more self-sufficient in defense advanced technologies. And that is an area where Britain is very good. You know, there are some industries where we are kind of world level. I suppose you could say international banking is one, pharmaceuticals is another. But the armaments industry, the defense industries are very good in the UK, which is why we're supplying you with advanced weapon systems. And I think the companies who are in that sector will see a very considerable potential for building up your armaments in defense industries and investing in Ukraine. I think a second area is that where Britain is actually very good around London, particularly, is in some of the high-tech industries with software, information sector activities. And a lot of, Ukrainian people came here in the last 20 years, 10 years particularly, and are working in or have set up companies in London. And I would imagine that those companies will want to rebuild their presence in Ukraine. So we will have a link with you in that way also.
As I know, a wide Ukrainian delegation was in London and summer this year, and there were a lot of talk about the reconstruction of Ukraine, big economical summit and official summit. But till this moment, we don't have such kind of plan or proposition from the Britain side of participation in reconstruction of Ukraine. Is it a problem of negotiation, or is it a problem of trust between our country, or is it a problem of a time of war? What do you think?
I think it's probably the last of those. It's the fact that there is a war happening. Now, I understood when I was there how important it is that you start. Sorry, yeah, my screen is affected. Just a moment. How important it is that the reconstruction starts now. But, capitalist companies are not going to take risk in a war situation without proper insurance. So I think that is the problem. One of the messages I'm giving to people in the UK is that, Kyiv is a very normal place, and driving through the towns in the west of Ukraine, this is just part of Europe and it's a functioning economy, and why don't British companies come here? But the image is, of course, of a wartime economy, and this, they will hang back and wait until the opportunities arrive later. So somebody needs to overcome the skepticism which arises from the fact that you're in the middle of a war. And the question I raised at my party conference, which I think you heard, was, why can't we make more use of the Russian assets? We have a lot of them in London. We had a lot of these very questionable oligarchs living here with British property, and it is now frozen. And I think where we could be doing more is by freeing these assets to use for reconstruction, or to provide a guarantee for companies investing in Ukraine. At the moment, nothing is happening. I think in terms of the oligarch assets, people are frightened of the lawyers, that these rich Russians will hire the world's best lawyers and obstruct using their assets. And there is a worry that if we tackle the Russian official reserves, that a lot of countries will then start fleeing into the renminbi because they no longer trust the Western governments to protect their money. So there are inhibitions about using the assets, but it seems to me that we should be showing more courage, more enterprise in using them as a basis for supporting reconstruction.
It's a very important problem for Ukraine because in the beginning of the war, first weeks of the war, different sources and different officials in the West said that they froze more than 600 billion Russian assets, officials, state assets, and private assets, oligarch assets. But now they are talking about few dozen of these assets. The amount of these assets was cutting down in 10 times. And from Ukrainian side, it looks like this money, these assets, like a political Rubicon, the line for our Western partners, which they are not ready to come through because it means that they will not make any agreement in the future with Russia. Before this line is not crossed, it means that they are able to negotiate with Russia, to make an agreement in the future and something like this. This is not all doors are closed between West and Russia, but only this money is the last door which can be closed between West and Russia if the West is honesty with its support to Ukraine. But also I understand your argument about the third countries. Of course, Western economies can lose a lot of money because losing the trust from another not democratic or half democratic countries around the world, which are suiting their assets in the Western economies. So, but it's very, 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 very hard problem, and it's not understandable from Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society, of course.
Well, I think it is true that until very recently, there were a lot of wishful thinking about Russia. I was in the government, as you have already said, and one of my jobs was actually to go to Russia, and as well as China, as well as India, Brazil, and Russia was seen as a very promising emerging market. It was only in 2014 when you had the first invasion and we started with sanctions that people began to question whether Russia was a big opportunity economically. Of course, we realized this ahead of the Germans and the French, but nonetheless, we were part of a general Western thinking that Russia is the future. And it has taken some time to adjust to a more pessimistic view. It is also true that until very recently, the Russian oligarchs saw Britain as a safe haven for their money. There were these famous people like Abramovich, who bought Chelsea Football Club, and we had Usmanov, who was in Arsenal. Britain was where they liked to be. They bought big houses. Their children were at school, and not just that, but there are a lot of lawyers and accountants who were helping these people and earning a lot of fees from supporting the oligarchs. And it's only within the last 2 years, I think, that Britain has finally cut the links to Russian money. And it's not simple. There are complex legal and accounting devices that were used as part of this laundromat kind of system. And it's only now being discontinued.
Why haven't we seen such strong reaction on the Russian occupation of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, like reaction in 2022?
Well, there was a reaction because I was in the government at the time, and we discussed how much we should proceed with sanctions, level 1, level 2, level 3. It was fully understood, I think, then that Russia had crossed a dangerous line and that economic sanctions were appropriate. And they were introduced. You could say maybe we should have done more quickly, but sanctions were introduced then. I think it's fair to say that, of course, Russia was not unique in taking territory from neighboring countries. Turkey still occupies half of Cyprus. The Moroccans took over half of their country from their neighbors. Israeli settlements, all of these things. So there were people in Britain who were willing to rationalize what Russia was doing and say, well, actually, it may be bad, but a lot of other people are doing bad things. So there wasn't the sense of urgency and extreme reaction, which was eventually precipitated by the full invasion last year.
Personally, how and when do you see the end of war in Ukraine?
I don't have a clear picture. You've produced some very good scenarios yourself, which are probably as good an analysis as anybody. No, I think people are obviously hoping that there will be a quick resolution and that the Russian defenses will crumble and you will win. That is the hope. But of course, you are quite right to tell us that we should. It's not the West should not become impatient. That is completely wrong. That you may have to fight a long war. And I think what's happening at present is that the Western countries, particularly Britain, the United States, are gradually realizing that this is not, you will not achieve your victory with just one clean, quick strike, but that this is a long attritional process, and we need to be maintaining support. And that is, I think, now much better understood, but it isn't yet factored into policy.
Thank you. As a former Secretary of State for Business Innovation, and a very experienced person in global trade, how do you see Ukraine's place in global economy after the war?
Well, we're already seeing why Ukraine matters, because it's a major exporter of grain. And until very recently, I think people had become very complacent about food supplies. World trade functioned very smoothly. And then suddenly we now realize that food is a scarce resource. And that you are one of the main producers. And I'm sure there are other key areas where Ukraine is an important player, but I think the grain embargo, which the Russians are trying to impose, has made everybody realize just how important Ukraine is in international trade.
What is the future of global economy in general? And in this view, what is the essence of global competition between China and the United States? What we, like political experts, economy, just citizens, should be waiting for this future competition?
And I worry a lot about the future economy, a great deal. I think we're in a bad place. Essentially, for most of the post-war era, the rich world and the poor world did very well on the back of globalization. I wrote a book about this in 1995, I think. And it was very good for everybody. Living standards were rising. Poor countries, especially China, increasingly India, entering the world economy, hundreds of millions of poorer people lifted out of poverty, and of course in the West, high living standards and also improving living standards. I think all of this changed in 2008 with the collapse of the banking system and the financial crisis, which destroyed confidence in the kind of globalization process. But it wasn't for another 8 years, 7, 8 years, that the political significance of this collapse became clear when we had Brexit in Britain and we had Trump in America. And Trump is historically very important because in many ways he destroyed the globalization model. He adopted the philosophy that trade is a zero-sum game, that if America gains, someone else loses. If somebody else, particularly China, does well, that means America loses. This is completely destroying the sensible globalization model, and we have been suffering the consequences ever since. The World Trade Organization is now largely ineffective. We are now getting this growing decoupling with China, which I think is very destructive and damaging. And there is now a very real risk that we have a world based essentially around two systems, the Chinese system and the Western system, but also more chaotic because you have these big new countries like India also trying to play a role in the world economy and being excluded because of tariffs and trade barriers. And instead of being a source of mutual enrichment, trade is now becoming a battleground. And this is very, very dangerous.
Is there a visible risk for the world financial system and role of dollar and euro? Now, I see like China central bank is lowering their assets in the United States reserves every year. I was talking about with Chinese experts. They are saying we are using dollars to buy more golds now. We are trying to make our trade for the national currencies as much as possible. Is there a significant risk for dividing the world in financial zone, not only a political?
Yes, there is a big risk because I think the Chinese attitude is, look, the Americans are now trying to stop us. They're trying to stop us rising economically. This is, I'm not saying my view, but their view is that we are potentially in a Cold War. They have also seen what the West did with Russian assets. So they want to diversify, move out of the dollar, to encourage other countries to move out of the dollar. One of the biggest decisions of significance within the last year was that of the Saudi Arabia-China agreement on currency, that Saudi Arabia will now invoice its exports in renminbi, not in dollars. And this kind of practice, I think, is spreading. And
they also have such type of agreement with Russia. Last data, 80% of China-Russia trade is on national currencies, in yuan, in rubles. We are talking about the hundreds of billion dollars.
Yes, also the Indians, the same, also the Emirates, not just Saudi Arabia. Yes, this is, and you know, the Latin American countries like Brazil also trying to diversify away from the dollars and over dependence on US transactions. Yes, I think it's a worrying trend.
What is waiting for us in the end of this path? Dividing the world, deglobalization, or even is there a risk of armed conflict between China and the West? How do you think?
Well, my view, and it's just my view, is that the European countries, which include Britain and also include Ukraine, need to hang together. Right? If the world is fragmenting, at the very least, the European Union should form a solidarity, and economically and perhaps even militarily. It's not good that Britain has left, but I think maybe with a change of governments in the UK, we won't rejoin the EU, but we will re-establish close links. So I think the first answer is greater European integration in a world where the economy in the world is fragmenting. I think the second is, I believe we should have a much more pragmatic approach to China. The British are falling behind the American line that China is an enemy, and I don't believe that. I think we should take the view that Russia is an enemy and a danger. China is, you know, there are threats, but there are also opportunities. We should deal with it pragmatically as a trade partner, as an investor. Of course, not to be naive about spying and these things, but we shouldn't treat China in the same way that we treat Russia.
Maybe you want to add something for our today's interview, Vince. Maybe every time I'm not sure that I was able to ask all necessary questions.
Sorry, I missed the last question.
And maybe you want to add something. Maybe I haven't asked you something important, and you want to add something, to say something more in the end of our interview.
No, well, I suppose just two thoughts, really. The first is that we're dealing with radical uncertainty. For most of the post-war era, the Cold War, you were part of the Soviet Union. It may not have been a very good experience, but at least it was stable, it was predictable, nothing strange was going to happen. And then you became a free country, and for 20, 30 years, we had the kind of liberal order in the world, which was also stable. But now we have chronic uncertainty. We don't know about American politics and Trump. We don't know how this war with you is going to resolve. We don't know about what will happen with China. Will they reach some pragmatic compromise, or will they invade Taiwan, for example? We don't know about the big emerging powers like India. Are they going to be good citizens, or genocide of Muslims? All kind of extraordinary, dangerous things can happen. And we have instability in the financial system again. We have trade conflicts. The world is very, very, very uncertain. It's very difficult to make long-term planning in this kind of environment. So that's my first observation. And I think the second is the simple point that we had with you, that I think for Britain, the consistent, very positive, I think values-based support for Ukraine was a good thing. I think, we feel good about it. We want you to win, and we'll continue to support you. And I think that although there are lots of negatives in British politics, this is one of the positives. And I think the message I'm giving British people and my own party is we must stick with a good policy.
Thank you very much. The Right Honourable Sir John Vincent Кейбл was with us today. Thank you, friends, for watching this interview. I will add all the links and all texts which Vincent will send us. Don't forget to subscribe and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.